Hello crafters, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSStamp.com. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana episode. In this video, I'm sharing a simple take on a one-layer stamped pattern card for a crafty friend. It's been a while since I've done any fun pattern stamping, and I thought it was time to revisit this awesome stamping technique. For me, pattern stamping is taking a small image or a grouping of small images and stamping them onto the background to fill the entire card front space in what appears to be a random or structured manner. So you can create a stamped pattern using just a single image. I'm using this fabulous Crafty stamp set from Kathy Zilski. And for example, I could pick just the image of the paintbrushes and stamp that image repeatedly to create a pattern. I could stamp it randomly or in a linear manner, and that will give me very different looks. Or I can use grouping of images. I love all of the images in this set. These crafty supplies look so adorable and very inspiring, so I opted to use all of them on my card. I stamped a test pattern onto a piece of scrap paper and even test colored my pattern to decide which colors to use for my final project. For this particular pattern, I reserved the space in the center of my background for the sentiment. I wanted the card to be a one-layer one, so I needed to leave space on the background for my message. The sentiment reads, "Oh say, can you craft with me all weekend long?" And because it is a pretty big message, and it is the focal point on this card, I stamp it first. Because I created my test pattern, I call it a stamping guide, I can now use it to recreate this pattern to the letter on my finished card. And then once I'm done, I can keep this stamping guide for future use if I ever want to do this card again, or maybe do this pattern again, but change the sentiment. So to recreate this pattern, I first placed my stamping guide inside my MISTI stamping tool, and I used it to position the stamps to build the background. It's very simple. I'm adding the stamps one by one, and I close the lid of my MISTI. I remove the stamping guide, and now I can ink up my images and stamp them onto my card front. This is also a very good way to stamp multiples. Since I am using MISTI and the image placement matters, I can stamp a bunch of panels in no time if I need to make several identical cards. I don't need to make identical cards now. I am just making one card, but if you were making birthday invitations, for example, you can easily stamp multiples using this technique. Having stamped the first batch of images, I place the stamping guide back inside the MISTI, and I keep positioning the images to continue building my pattern. And I love how easy it is. And remember, you can apply this technique to building a background using any type of images you want. I did my stamping on Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I stamped everything in Hero Art's Intensified Black ink, which is a Copic marker-friendly ink, and it is also resistant to water. I will be using Copics to do my coloring, and then I plan to add a wink of Stella marker, which has a little bit of water in it, so I need to make sure that my ink is not going to bleed when it comes in contact with these two mediums. Now, if you look carefully, you'll notice that I have a small white border around the edges of my panel. This was my intention. I didn't want this pattern to extend past the edges of the card. Rather, I wanted to keep it contained. So when placing my images, I made sure to step away from the edge of the card and leave about a 1/4 inch gap. Next comes the fun coloring part. I'm using Copic markers for my coloring, and the coloring is super basic here. I just need to add pops of color. I don't need to do any fancy blending or shading. This card is not about the coloring. It is more about the pattern itself. I'm using Y08 and Y19 to color the rulers yellow. I'm coloring the pencil yellow as well. Next, using YG01 and YG03 to color the scissors and the paint tubes green. Next, BG11 and BG13 to color the single paintbrush teal and also the single hearts teal. E33 and E37 to color the barrel of the paintbrush brown, and E15 to color the bristles a different shade of brown. Next, I use several shades of gray, C5, C3, and C1 to color any metal pieces, such as metal pieces on the paintbrushes, and then the paint tubes. I wanted them to appear white, so I used a little bit of gray to add shading around the edges. I'm also using the C3 and C1 markers to add shading to the paint palettes. Next, RV10 to color the hearts on the rulers pink, and then to add color to the paint palettes, and also to color the other paintbrush. I'm also using R05, YR04, Y08, YG03, BG11, and BV02 to color my paint palettes, to add the color to those. And this pretty much finishes my coloring. I also added shading under each object using a C1 marker. This helped ground the objects on the card. And I also added the shadow under the word craft. It was big enough to add a little bit of shading under it. And I love this look. Now, I did trim this panel a little bit, and to add sturdiness to my card, I adhered 2 scrap sheets of cardstock together, and I used those to lightly pop the colored panel up on the background. So there is a little bit of dimension, but it is only 2 sheets of cardstock thick. So this card is still pretty thin and easily mailable. Finally, to add some more wow to this project, I used my Wink of Stella glitter pen and glossy accents. I coated the paints and the hearts with the Wink of Stella to add a little bit of glitter, and then added glossy accent dots over the paint wells and also over the tiny hearts. And here is the look at the finished card. I hope you feel inspired to create, pull out your stamps, little stamps, and stamp any pattern you want. If you make a card inspired by this video, we'd love it if you shared your project online and tagged us on social media. We always enjoy seeing what you make. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys, and I'll see you next time.